So today, lecture 4 of competition policy. And in this lecture, we'll be discussing vertical integration and foreclosure. So vertical relations essentially between different companies. So what we'll look into, I'll first give an introduction briefly, and then we'll go to some pro-competitive motivations for having certain contractual clauses in the contracts between vertical partners in a supply chain. Particularly have a look at double marginalization. And then the larger part, I guess, of this lecture will be on anti-competitive concerns, in particular about something which will be called foreclosure. So what are vertical relations? So, well, we have been looking at the horizontal relations, particularly at horizontal mergers so far. So in a horizontal merger, as you know, we look at two or perhaps even more rivals who are active in the same market. So it might be different producers of beers which are competing in the same market for selling to end users. Or they've been looking at this merger among these deodorant producers who produce rival brands which compete for market share again in the same market for consumers. And if these companies merge, and typically this creates stronger market power. So this, all else equal, leads to a rise in prices generically, and except if there's of course large synergies in costs which might counteract those rises in prices. So this is actually different if you look at vertically related firms. So this part of the course is related to Malta's chapter 6. So have a look at that, and in particular also I'm going to focus now on the paper by Ray and Turol, the chapter by Ray and Turol, and in particular sections 1 and 2 for today. So the idea is that we'll be looking at some upstream firm or upstream provider of some input, so input good, which is supplying this input good to some downstream producer or retailing firm. So, one example that we will have a look at is in the market for maps and navigation software. And of course, you can understand that if you build navigation software, you have to buy somewhere your maps, basically the geographic data. So there might be a provider, which we call the upstream firm, of this input data for this software firm, who on one hand in this buys these maps from this upstream supplier, and then as a downstream firm itself, it will then sell onwards their products to end users, for instance. So other examples, of course, are manufacturers of goods who sell their goods through retail shops. And basically, there's different partners in a supply chain, basically, who are vertically related and who are not direct competitors, who actually have to cooperate to be able to supply the end good to end users. So a final example is steel producer who might be supplying steel as an input good to, say, a car manufacturer who's using the steel to produce a car. So those would be vertical supply chains, and these firms who are partners in this supply chain will be vertically related. Well, these firms will obviously have certain contracts, and they might also go together and integrate. So we'll have to sort of have a view, or have a competition authority will have to decide on the effects of a merger between two such firms. So we'll have a look at this map navigation software in an example, and of course you can think of many other examples of such mergers. So that's one thing that we would like to understand a bit better. So what's the effect of a vertical merger rather than a horizontal merger? Another issue that we'll be having a much closer look at is contractual restraints between companies. So what are those? Well, if you think about the vertically related companies, well, of course these companies will have some contract dealing with their relation. Well, first of all, this contract will specify, of course, the prices and the quantities that these firms will buy, so that the downstream firm will buy from the upstream firm. And now, of course, you have to know that, in the simplest example, this will just be a single price, but that's actually pretty rare, right? So even if you go to the supermarket, it's very seldom that you can buy any quantity that you want, and typically the goods that you will buy will come in pre-packaged sizes, if you wish. And typically you might also see that if you buy a bigger box of chocolates, then this bigger box will not be proportionally priced to a smaller box, but typically there will be, for instance, quantity discounts. Well, the same, but with a vengeance, will hold for firms which are contracting with each other. They will typically negotiate certain quantity discounts. So if you buy more, then the price will be lower pro rata. Another way in which this might be reflected would be rebates, which says, if you buy an amount, a quantity, which goes beyond some predefined quantity, then you'll get back some of the remunerate you some of the cost for the first sales that we made. Quantity forcing is sort of more stronger form of that. Basically, it says we just agree on, this is the quantity that you're going to buy, and this is the price that you're going to pay for it. And there's just no discussion of any other quantity that you might buy. We just agree on, this is what you have to buy, because this upstream firm will have to invest a lot of effort and money to basically make exactly this quantity of goods. So if you buy a number of airplanes, if you're an airliner, you typically agree on the number of planes, and you don't just say, well, just give me a price and then I'll decide on what the number of planes will be. So this contract will typically include both a quantity and then a total amount of money, basically, that you'll be paying for that quantity. And if you would like to buy more or a different quantity, you have to renegotiate the price as well. Another form of that would be a fixed fee and variable fee, or two-part tariff, as it's usually called. So if you enter into some agreement, there might be a per unit price, so the variable fee, which might be perhaps lower, but you will also pay some fixed fee, perhaps to cover the fixed costs of this upstream firm, in addition to that variable fee. So that will be contract, a price which consists of two parts, a fixed part and a variable part, so a two-part tariff, as it's called. So that's the price and the quantity that you might see in vertical contracts, but there will typically be, or often be, other conditions as well in such contracts. In particular, there might be some restraints which say, well, you cannot do certain things. So one such restraint might be exclusivity. So that's a typical constraint in which one form of this might be that the upstream supplier in this contract will promise not to make any sales to rival retailers. So if you're a retailer and you want to sell some manufacturer's goods in your shop, you might want to negotiate with this manufacturer that there will not be a retailer which is neighboring your firm, which will also supply those same goods and who will be a fierce competitor then with your own sales. So that would be exclusivity. So exclusivity just means you will only sell in this area to me and not to my neighbors in the street. Perhaps in a different part of the city, okay, but not too close by. Another form of exclusivity might be on the part of the retailer who promises not to sell goods of rival producers. So some shops might exclusively sell the goods of one producer and will not also sell goods of other producers. So for instance, a bar or a cafe might sell exclusively the beers of one particular producers and will not stock basically the brands from some rival beer brewer. So that's exclusivity. Then there might also be restraints on downstream pricing. So of course the upstream pricing will be, of course, that's the first part that we just discussed, that will be specified in the contracts. But the contract might also have a retail price maintenance clause, or it might have that, which says that the prices which are at which the good will be sold to the end user consumers in the shop can actually not be below some price that has been specified in the negotiations between this the manufacturer and the and say the supermarket, for instance. So that would be retail price maintenance. One other type of restraint, one other kind of clause that you might see in such contracts would be the so-called most favored nation clause, in which the producer says, well, this is the price retailer that you're paying for my goods, and I'm going to promise you that I'm not going to sell my goods to some other retailer at a lower price. And if I do so, well, then you have the right to get this lower price as well. So if this producer will sell at a lower price, it has to match this lower price to the original retailer. So those are all examples of additional conditions or restraints that might appear in these vertical contracts. So why would companies have these kinds of restraints in the contracts among them? So well, there might be very pro-competitive reasons, so make the supply chain more efficient in a way. One example that we'll have a look at in just a moment is double marginalization problems. So if you don't sort of take account into these, everybody basically might be worse off by not coordinating sufficiently pricing behavior upstream and downstream. And there might also be motivations that have to do with the internalization of some external effects. So there might be behaviors that individually some company might want to pursue, with which might be bad for the other company and might actually be bad for welfare. And these various contract partners, the upstream and the downstream firms in this supply chain, might want to sort of foresee this and want to take care of that in their contracts. So, of course, competition authorities and policymakers know that these pro-competitive efficiency reasons exist, and therefore there are substantial safe harbors, and there are also large exemptions, if you wish, or large groups of practices that will not be looked into closely by competition authorities precisely for this reason. So you don't have to worry too much if you're a small producer and a small downstream firm. Well, then a lot of these behaviors are actually allowed, and there's just a small blacklist basically of behaviors that will never be allowed. On the other hand, there might also be some anti-competitive effects for having such clauses. Anti-competitive in the sense of blocking markets, or blocking competition by rival firms. And particularly what one might have in mind here is something which is called foreclosure, and which we will be having a closer look into later in this lecture. So foreclosure basically means that you impede the competition for some rival firm. And one example of how you might do that is by refusing, if you're an upstream firm, refusing to supply some downstream firm in order to give a monopoly perhaps, or stronger market power to another downstream firm. Or perhaps you do supply, but you give a lower quality to make them less strong competitors, perhaps to your own downstream sales branch. So that would be examples of foreclosure. And foreclosure might be forbidden by competition law, particularly if it's related if it's practiced by some dominant firm. So because then we might be in the realm of this Article 102 of the Treaty for the Function of the European Union, TFEU, and we might actually have a case of abuse of dominance. And particularly what we will focus on in this lecture, in the next few lectures actually, is exclusionary abuse. So you remember the different kinds of abuse. There was exclusionary abuse was one of those, and we also had, for instance, abuse by high pricing. But here we'll be looking on this exclusionary type. So particularly we'll be looking today at input foreclosure. So what that means is that we'll have an upstream monopolist, so the manufacturer will be a monopoly manufacturer, and there might be a downstream industry which is at least potentially is competitive. So there's multiple firms there which might all be active and which might all sell this upstream monopolist good to the downstream consumers. Well, the competition issue here would be then input foreclosure. So the input foreclosure means that there might be a risk that this upstream firm, so this manufacturer, will refuse to supply this input. Input foreclosure will refuse to supply their input to some of the downstream firms. So it will sell their goods to some firms but not to others. And this might happen, for instance, as a result of some vertical merger. So that's what is the interest of this topic for merger analysis, for vertical merger analysis. Is there some risk that the vertically integrated firm will then no longer supply the goods to some particular downstream firms which might previously have been made sure there was a lot of competition in the market? So that would be the effect of vertical mergers, but there might also be exclusive contracts which cause input foreclosure. And again, so what we'll be asking is, well, we know there might be good reasons for this, but we have to wonder, might there also be bad reasons in the sense of bad for welfare? So that's the question that we should be focusing on. Is there some form of input foreclosure, some exclusive contracting, for instance, which is actually harming welfare? In that case, if it's practiced by some dominant firm, might be a reason for the competition authority to actually to make a case against this. So in the picture, this is what the framework basically will look like. So there will be some supplier, the upstream firm, who might in principle supply both retailer 1 and retailer 2, who will both be competing to sell their end goods to consumers. But sometimes this dashed box here basically means this supplier and retailer 1 will have some kind of special relationship, so they might either be integrated in a single firm after a merger, or they might have such an exclusive contract which will actually prevent the supplier, prohibit the supplier from selling also their upstream input goods to retailer 2, basically therefore forcing, for instance, retailer 2 out of the market for this particular product. So that's input foreclosure view. So the input to retailer 2 of retailer 2 is foreclosed from its input to this good supplied by the manufacturer, the upstream firm. So what we'll do next week is basically the converse situation, in which there will be a single retailer and potentially multiple suppliers who will be upstream or might be competitors, potential competitors, and then we'll have a look at the other side of this, which might be customer foreclosure. So customer foreclosure means, well, again, the supplier A and the retailer might have this special contract, this, for instance, exclusive contract, or again, they might have merged into a single firm, and they might actually block access to the market for supplier B. So they will also have an agreement not to supply the goods that are produced by B to end users through their shops. And that might be a case of customer foreclosure. So that's the other side of this. So that's the issue that we'll be looking at, foreclosure. So first, in the next video, we'll have a look at these pro-competitive motivations for exclusive contracts or for integration, for instance. In particular, we have a look at a review, essentially, the theory of double marginalization, which I've seen before in your micro courses. And after that, we'll go on to discuss the anti-competitive concerns that I just mentioned, so foreclosure.